What if the very first sign of dementia in someone you love isn't memory loss, but something far more personal, something they might be deeply ashamed to talk about? It's a difficult question, but one we need to address. We often associate dementia with forgetting names or misplacing keys, but the reality is often more complex and, frankly, more uncomfortable. Over 60% of dementia cases are initially spotted by family members. Not because of classic memory lapses, but because something subtle, awkward, or even downright embarrassing begins to happen in their loved one's behavior. These aren't just minor eccentricities, they can be significant shifts in personality and conduct. Imagine strange new personal habits emerging, unusual behaviors that seem out of character, or actions they've never exhibited before and clearly don't want anyone else to witness. These could be anything from changes in hygiene to peculiar social interactions. These odd behaviors, the ones that might make you pause and wonder where did that come from, may actually be the brain's earliest warning signals, a quiet alarm bell indicating that something is amiss neurologically. It's crucial to understand that these aren't willful acts or mere quirks of aging. They can be manifestations of underlying changes in the brain, and if someone you love is exhibiting these kinds of behaviors, it's imperative to pay close attention now before the potential damage progresses further and becomes more difficult to manage. Recognizing these early, often embarrassing signs can be the key to timely intervention and support. In this video, you'll discover 7 uncomfortable real-life habits that, according to caregiver stories and backed by medical research, revealed dementia years before a formal diagnosis was made. These are sensitive topics, but understanding them can make all the difference. Let's begin. Let's talk about Daryl. Daryl was a meticulously organized accountant, a man who prided himself on his precision and control in all aspects of his life. His wife, Susan, first noticed something was off not when he misplaced his glasses, but when he started having accidents, failing to make it to the bathroom in time. Initially, she attributed it to perhaps a urinary tract infection or just getting older, but these incidents became more frequent, and Daryl, a man who was always so composed, became increasingly embarrassed and withdrawn. He'd try to hide soiled clothes or make excuses, clearly distressed by his inability to control this fundamental bodily function. Susan recalls the deep shame in his eyes, a stark contrast to the confident man she knew. This wasn't just about an aging bladder, it was a sign of something deeper. Early dementia, particularly certain types, can significantly damage the intricate neural pathways responsible for managing bodily signals. Think of the brain as a complex communication center. It needs to correctly interpret the signal from the bladder that it's getting full, then process the urgency of that signal, and finally coordinate the physical actions required to get to a toilet and relieve oneself in a timely manner. When dementia begins to affect these specific brain regions, this entire system can break down. The brain might not register the bladder's fullness correctly, or it might misjudge the time needed to act. For Daryl, the part of his brain that managed these signals was slowly being compromised. The urgency he once felt, the internal alarm clock that said time to go, was becoming unreliable. This loss of control over a very private bodily function was profoundly humiliating for him. It's a symptom often shrouded in secrecy due to its personal nature, but it's a critical one to recognize. Family members might notice more frequent trips to the bathroom, sudden dashes, or, like in Daryl's case, accidents that are completely out of character. These aren't signs of laziness or carelessness. They can be direct neurological indicators. Understanding this connection is vital because it shifts the perspective from blame or embarrassment to concern and a need for medical investigation. The brain's control over bladder function is complex, involving areas responsible for sensory processing, decision-making, and motor control. Early damage from dementia can disrupt any part of this chain. For instance, the frontal lobes, which are involved in executive functions like planning and impulse control, play a crucial role. If these are affected, a person might feel the urge but be unable to plan the steps to get to the bathroom or inhibit urination until they get there. So, if you observe a loved one suddenly struggling with incontinence or a new persistent urgency that leads to accidents, especially if they seem ashamed or try to hide it, consider it a potential red flag. It's not just an old age problem to be dismissed. It could be an early manifestation of dementia affecting the brain's ability to manage one of the body's most basic processes. This was the first uncomfortable clue for Susan that Daryl's brain was changing in ways neither of them could have initially imagined, prompting them to seek the medical advice that eventually led to his diagnosis. Now, let's consider Loretta. Loretta was a retired English teacher known for her eloquent speech and precise vocabulary. Her daughter Carol started noticing a peculiar change. Loretta began using simplistic language, sometimes even slipping into a kind of baby talk, using diminutive words or a sing-song tone she hadn't used since Carol was a toddler. At first, Carol thought it was an odd, fleeting quirk, perhaps an attempt at being playful, but it became more persistent. Loretta would address her adult children and even strangers with overly affectionate, almost childlike phrases, and her sentence structures became less complex. This was a stark departure for a woman who once corrected grammar with gentle precision. This shift in language wasn't a conscious choice. It was an indicator of changes occurring within her brain's language centers. Dementia, especially types like frontotemporal dementia, FTD, can profoundly affect these areas. FTD often impacts the frontal and temporal lobes of the brain, regions critical for language, personality, and behavior. As these areas degenerate, a person's ability to use and understand complex language can diminish. They might struggle to find the right words, leading them to revert to simpler, more familiar vocabulary, sometimes words and speech patterns learned in early childhood. Furthermore, the emotional control centers of the brain can also be affected. This can lead to what's known as emotional dysregulation, where individuals might express emotions in ways that seem inappropriate for the situation or out of character. For Loretta, the baby talk might have been linked not just to a decline in her linguistic abilities, but also to a change in her emotional processing. She might have been experiencing a regression in her emotional expression, or perhaps the simpler language felt safer or easier as her cognitive abilities waned. Her daughter found it increasingly awkward, especially in public, as it made her mother seem less like the intelligent woman she was. Caregivers often report this phenomenon. A loved one who was once articulate and adult in their communication suddenly starts using phrases or tones that sound childish. It can be disorienting and even embarrassing for family members who struggle to reconcile this new way of speaking with the person they've always known. It's important to understand that this isn't an intentional act of regression or a bid for attention in the way a child might seek it. It's a symptom of the brain struggling to maintain its higher-level linguistic and emotional functions. Recognizing this as a potential sign of dementia is crucial. If you notice a loved one consistently using overly simplistic language, baby talk, or showing a marked decline in their vocabulary and sentence complexity, especially if it's accompanied by changes in emotional expression or social appropriateness, it warrants a medical consultation. For Loretta, this change in speech, so incongruous with her lifelong passion for language, was a significant, though uncomfortable, clue that pointed towards the frontotemporal dementia that was beginning to reshape her mind and her way of communicating with the world. Let's turn to Glenn. Glenn was always a reserved man, a private individual who kept his personal life well personal. His son, Mark, started to notice a very uncharacteristic change during family gatherings and even casual encounters. Glenn began oversharing, revealing deeply personal or sometimes inappropriate details to near strangers or distant relatives. He might discuss his financial situation in detail with the mailman, or share intimate details about his health or marital issues with a new acquaintance at a party. Mark was mortified, constantly trying to steer conversations or gently intervene. But Glenn seemed oblivious to the social awkwardness he was creating. This newfound lack of filter wasn't Glenn suddenly deciding to become an open book. It was a sign that his brain's ability to judge social appropriateness was becoming impaired. Early dementia can affect the frontal lobes, the part of our brain responsible for executive functions. These functions include impulse control, social judgment, and understanding social cues, essentially our internal filter that tells us what's appropriate to say and what's not, and to whom. When this area is damaged, individuals can lose their ability to self-monitor their behavior and speech in social contexts. For Glenn, the subtle rules of social engagement, the unwritten code of conduct that dictates what information is suitable for public consumption, began to erode. He wasn't intentionally trying to embarrass his son or make others uncomfortable. His brain was simply losing its capacity to make those fine distinctions. He might not recognize that discussing his bowel habits with a new neighbor is generally considered inappropriate, or that revealing sensitive family secrets at a dinner party could cause distress. This lack of social inhibition can be one of the more challenging and embarrassing symptoms for families to deal with. It's a common theme in caregiver stories. The person with early dementia says things that are tactless, overly personal, or even offensive without any apparent awareness of the impact of their words. They might comment inappropriately on someone's appearance, ask intrusive questions, or share private information freely. This isn't a reflection of their true character or a sudden desire to be rude. It's a neurological symptom. The part of the brain that would normally say, maybe I shouldn't say that, is no longer functioning effectively. This can lead to social isolation, as friends and even family members may withdraw due to the discomfort these interactions can cause. If you notice a loved one consistently oversharing, making socially inappropriate comments, or demonstrating a significant loss of their usual social filter, it's a serious concern. Don't dismiss it as them just being eccentric or losing their manners. It could be an early indication that the frontal lobes are being affected by a neurodegenerative process. For Mark, Glenn's uncharacteristic and often embarrassing candor was a clear signal that something significant was changing in his father's brain, prompting a medical evaluation that confirmed early-stage dementia. Understanding this helps families navigate these difficult social situations with more empathy and seek appropriate help. Chapter 4. The Phantom Career, Clinging to Familiar Routines. Consider the story of Wanda. Wanda had been a dedicated nurse for over 40 years before she retired. A few years into her retirement, her husband Tom noticed a peculiar new routine. Wanda started getting dressed in her old nursing uniform remnants, a specific cardigan she always wore, her comfortable nursing shoes, and would announce she was off to the hospital. She'd pack a lunch, sometimes even try to leave the house. When Tom gently reminded her she was retired, Wanda would often become confused, agitated, or insist she had a shift to cover. She was, in essence, making up a fake job, or rather, reliving a deeply ingrained part of her past identity. This wasn't Wanda being deliberately difficult or forgetful in the usual sense. It was a manifestation of how the brain, in early dementia, often clings to familiar routines and identities as a way to mask underlying confusion and anxiety. Work routines, especially for those in long-held careers, are deeply embedded. These routines provide structure, purpose, and a sense of self. As cognitive abilities decline, the world can become a confusing and frightening place. Reverting to these old familiar scripts can be a coping mechanism, an attempt by the brain to find solid ground in a shifting reality. For Wanda, her identity as a nurse was strong. The act of preparing for work was a deeply ingrained motor and cognitive sequence. Even as other memories and abilities faded, this powerful routine persisted. The brain, struggling to make sense of the present, might retrieve these strong procedural memories. This behavior, sometimes called confabulation, when individuals create false memories or narratives without intending to deceive, can be a hallmark of certain types of dementia. Wanda wasn't lying about going to work. In her mind, in that moment, it felt real and necessary. This can be incredibly distressing for family members. Tom found it heartbreaking and confusing to see Wanda so convinced she needed to be at a job she hadn't held for years. He had to learn to navigate these episodes with patience, often redirecting her attention gently rather than directly confronting her reality, which could lead to more agitation. It's a delicate balance. Understanding that this behavior stems from the brain's attempt to cope rather than from stubbornness or delusion is key to providing compassionate support. So, if a loved one who is retired starts talking about going to their old job, gets ready for work, or even fabricates details about a current, non-existent job, pay close attention. It's more than just reminiscence. It can be a sign that they are struggling with their current reality, and their brain is defaulting to strong past routines to maintain a sense of order and identity. This adherence to past roles, especially when it involves a disconnect from present reality, was a significant, albeit poignant, indicator for Tom that Wanda's cognitive decline was progressing, leading them to seek further medical support for her dementia. Chapter 5, The Unintentional Undress, When Social Norms Fade. Let's talk about Nancy. Nancy was always impeccably dressed, a woman who took great pride in her appearance and adhered to social graces. Her daughter Sarah began to notice unsettling changes. Nancy started walking around her home and sometimes even near the front door or windows partially undressed. She might be wearing a nightgown in the middle of the afternoon with visitors present, or forget to put on a skirt or trousers, wearing only her undergarments with a blouse. When Sarah gently pointed it out, Nancy would often seem surprised or indifferent, not displaying her usual sense of modesty or embarrassment. This behavior wasn't a sudden streak of exhibitionism or a deliberate disregard for propriety. It was a concerning sign that early dementia was beginning to disrupt Nancy's awareness of social norms and her ability to maintain her personal appearance appropriately. The brain regions responsible for self-awareness, understanding social context, and sequencing tasks like getting fully dressed can be compromised by dementia. What might seem like a simple act of getting dressed involves a complex series of cognitive steps. Recognizing the need to dress, choosing appropriate clothing for the situation, and then physically putting it on in the correct order. For Nancy, this sequence was breaking down. She might forget a step, or her understanding of what was socially acceptable attire for a given situation could be fading. The part of her brain that would normally register, "I shouldn't answer the door without being fully clothed," was not functioning as it once did. This loss of awareness can be particularly distressing for family members because it's such a visible and often public deviation from the person's established character. Sarah found it deeply troubling to see her mother, who was always so put together in these vulnerable states. It's important to distinguish this from simple forgetfulness. This isn't just about misplacing an item of clothing. It's about a fundamental disconnect from social expectations and personal presentation. The person might not realize they are inappropriately dressed, or they may lack the cognitive ability to correct the situation even if it's pointed out. This can also extend to other aspects of personal grooming and hygiene, which may also decline as the disease progresses. These changes can be very embarrassing for the individual if they have moments of clarity, and certainly for the family. If you observe a loved one frequently appearing partially undressed in inappropriate situations, or showing a significant decline in their attention to personal appearance and social appropriateness in dress, it's a serious indicator that warrants investigation. Don't just attribute it to eccentricity or old age. For Sarah, Nancy's uncharacteristic lack of concern about her state of dress was a clear and uncomfortable signal that her mother's cognitive world was changing profoundly, prompting the need for a dementia assessment. It highlighted how dementia can strip away not just memories, but also ingrained social awareness. Chapter 6. The Table Manners Shift. When eating habits regress. Now let's consider Leon. Leon was known for his good table manners, a man who always used his knife and fork properly and enjoyed mealtimes as a social occasion. His wife, Maria, started noticing some very strange and unsettling changes in his behavior at the dinner table. Leon began eating with his hands, even for foods like mashed potatoes or stew, which he would never have done before. Sometimes he would pick food directly off other people's plates without asking, or even lick his own plate clean in a way that was completely out of character. Maria was initially shocked and then deeply concerned. These unusual table behaviors weren't Leon suddenly forgetting his manners or being intentionally rude. Strange eating habits and a regression in table etiquette can often be an early and quite awkward red flag for dementia. The cognitive processes involved in eating are more complex than we might realize. They involve recognizing food, understanding how to use utensils, coordinating hand-eye movements, and adhering to social conventions around mealtimes. Dementia can disrupt these processes in various ways. For Leon, the part of his brain that governed fine motor skills needed for utensil use might have been affected, or the part responsible for social inhibition and understanding appropriate behavior could have been declining, similar to the oversharing Glenn experienced. He might also have been experiencing changes in his sensory perception of food, or difficulty recognizing utensils and their purpose. Sometimes, individuals with dementia develop specific food cravings or aversions, or they might forget they have just eaten and demand more food. The act of licking the plate, while embarrassing for onlookers, might stem from an intense hunger sensation or simply a loss of the social understanding that this is not typically done. Maria found these changes particularly difficult to manage, especially when they had guests. She tried to gently guide Leon, but he often seemed confused by her corrections or didn't understand what he was doing was unusual. It's a symptom that can lead to social isolation, as families might become hesitant to eat out or have people over. Understanding the neurological basis can help reframe this behavior not as a deliberate act of poor manners, but as a consequence of brain changes. For instance, frontotemporal dementia can particularly lead to changes in eating habits, including overeating or a preference for sweet foods, alongside disinhibited behaviors. If you notice a loved one developing new and unusual eating habits, such as consistently using their hands for all foods, a sudden disregard for table manners they once held, or other strange behaviors around meal times, it's important to take note. These aren't just quirky new habits, they can be indicative of underlying cognitive decline. For Maria, Leon's regression at the dinner table was a significant and uncomfortable sign that his dementia was impacting even the most ingrained social behaviors, prompting a deeper conversation with his doctors about managing his symptoms. Chapter 7. The Public Spit, When Bodily Awareness Falters. Finally, let's discuss Mary. Mary was a gentle, considerate woman who would never have dreamed of doing anything to make others uncomfortable. Her son David was horrified when Mary started spitting, not just outdoors, but sometimes indoors in public places or even during conversations. It wasn't an aggressive act, but rather seemed almost involuntary, as if she were unaware of doing it or unable to control it. David found it incredibly embarrassing and struggled to understand why his refined mother would suddenly develop such a socially unacceptable habit. He tried to address it, but Mary often seemed confused or denied it altogether. This distressing behavior wasn't Mary intentionally trying to be offensive or unhygienic. The act of spitting in inappropriate contexts can be linked to how dementia alters the brain's processing of swallowing, saliva production, and overall bodily awareness. Our ability to manage saliva, swallow effectively, and recognize the appropriate time and place for expelling anything from our mouths is a complex neurological function. Dementia can impair the nerves and brain regions that control these processes. For Mary, several factors could have been at play. She might have been experiencing difficulties swallowing, dysphagia, a common issue in later stages of dementia, but one that can begin subtly. If saliva accumulates in the mouth and swallowing is impaired or feels uncomfortable, the person might resort to spitting as a way to clear it. Alternatively, the part of her brain responsible for recognizing social cues and inhibiting inappropriate actions could have been affected, similar to other disinhibition symptoms we've discussed. She might genuinely not perceive spitting indoors as problematic or lack the impulse control to prevent it. Furthermore, sensory changes can occur with dementia. Mary might have had an altered sensation in her mouth, perhaps feeling like there was excess saliva or something that needed to be expelled, even if that wasn't objectively the case. The brain's ability to correctly interpret bodily sensations can go awry. David found himself constantly on edge, trying to preempt these moments or discreetly clean up, all while feeling a mix of embarrassment and deep concern for his mother's deteriorating condition. It was a behavior that was hard to ignore and even harder to explain to others. If you observe a loved one developing a new habit of spitting inappropriately, especially if it's out of character and they seem unaware or unable to control it, it's a serious symptom that should be discussed with a healthcare professional. It's not just a bad habit, it can signal underlying neurological issues related to swallowing, sensory processing, or impulse control, all of which can be affected by dementia. For David, Mary's spitting was a stark and deeply uncomfortable indicator of how profoundly dementia was impacting her brain, affecting not just her memory but her very sense of bodily control and social appropriateness. So, if someone you love is exhibiting behaviors they'd likely be deeply embarrassed to admit, things that seem out of character, socially awkward, or even a bit shocking, please don't just brush it off as a mere quirk of aging or a deliberate act of eccentricity. These aren't just minor oddities. As we've explored through these 7 uncomfortable examples, such behaviors might very well be the brain's first, desperate cry for help, signaling the onset of dementia long before more commonly recognized symptoms like severe memory loss become prominent. The key takeaway here is the critical importance of early action. In the context of dementia, waiting is often the biggest mistake. While a diagnosis can be daunting, early recognition allows for timely medical evaluation, access to support services, potential interventions that might slow progression or manage symptoms, and crucial time for families to plan and adapt. Ignoring these early, often embarrassing signs delays this vital process, potentially allowing the condition to advance unchecked, making management more challenging down the line. Understanding and empathy are your greatest tools, and there you have it. 7 surprising and often uncomfortable early signs of dementia that you shouldn't ignore. These are difficult conversations to have and challenging behaviors to witness, but awareness is the first step toward helping someone you care about. What are your thoughts or experiences with this? Next, we encourage you to dive into this video right here for more essential tips to transform your health and help you thrive. You're going to love it. Thanks for watching Perfect Vlogs, and we'll see you there.